The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam by Dr. Muhammad Iqbal. Lecture 6. The Principle of Movement in the Structure of Islam. As a cultural movement, Islam rejects the old static view of the universe and reaches a dynamic view. As an emotional system of unification, it recognizes the worth of the individual as such and rejects blood relationship as a basis of human unity. Blood relationship is earth-rootedness. The search for a purely psychological foundation of human unity becomes possible only with the perception that all human life is spiritual in its origin. Such a perception is creative of fresh loyalties without any ceremonial to keep them alive, and makes it possible for man to emancipate himself from the earth. Christianity, which had originally appeared as a monastic order, was tried by Constantine as a system of unification. Its failure to work as such a system drove the Emperor Julian to return to the old gods of Rome, on which he attempted to put philosophical interpretations. A modern historian of civilization has thus depicted the state of the civilized world about the time when Islam appeared on the stage of history. It seemed then that the great civilization that it had taken 4,000 years to construct was on the verge of disintegration, and that mankind was likely to return to that condition of barbarism, where every tribe and sect was against the next, and law and order were unknown. The old tribal sanctions had lost their power. Hence, the old imperial methods would no longer operate. The new sanctions created by Christianity were working division and destruction instead of unity and order. It was a time fraught with tragedy. Civilization, like a gigantic tree whose foliage had overarched the world and whose branches had borne the golden fruit of art and science and literature, stood tottering, its trunk no longer alive with the flowing sap of devotion and reverence, but rotted to the core, riven by the storms of war, and held together only by the cords of ancient customs and laws that might snap at any moment. Was there any emotional culture that could be brought in to gather mankind once more into unity and to save civilization? This culture must be something of a new type, for the old sanctions and ceremonials were dead, and to build up others of the same kind would be the work of centuries. The writer then proceeds to tell us that the world stood in need of a new culture to take the place of the culture of the throne and the systems of unification which were based on blood relationship. It is amazing, he adds, that such a culture should have arisen from Arabia, just at the time when it was most needed. There is, however, nothing amazing in the phenomenon. The world life intuitively sees its own needs and, at critical moments, defines its own direction. This is what, in the language of religion, we call prophetic revelation. It is only natural that Islam should have flashed across the consciousness of a simple people, untouched by any of the ancient cultures and occupying a geographical position where three continents meet together. The new culture finds the foundation of world unity in the principle of Tawheed. Islam, as a polity, is only a practical means of making this principle a living factor in the intellectual and emotional life of mankind. It demands loyalty to God, not to the thrones. And since God is the ultimate spiritual basis of all life, loyalty to God virtually amounts to man's loyalty to his own ideal nature. The ultimate spiritual basis of all life, as conceived by Islam, is eternal and reveals itself in variety and change. A society based on such a conception of reality must reconcile in its life the categories of permanence and change. It must possess eternal principles to regulate its collective life. For the eternal gives us a foothold in the world of perpetual change. But eternal principles, when they are understood to exclude all possibilities of change, which, according to the Quran, is one of the greatest signs of God, tend to immobilize what is essentially mobile in its nature. The failure of the Europe in political and social sciences illustrates the former principle. The immobility of Islam during the last 500 years illustrates the latter. What then is the principle of movement in the structure of Islam? This is known as Ijtihad. The word literally means to exert. In the terminology of Islamic law, it means to exert with a view to form an independent judgment on a legal question. The idea, I believe, has its origin in a well-known verse of the Quran. And to those who exert, we shall show our path. We find it more definitely adumbrated in a tradition of the Holy Prophet. When Muaz was appointed ruler of Yemen, the Prophet is reported to have asked him as to how he would decide matters coming up before him. I will judge matters according to the book of God, said Muaz. But if the book of God contains nothing to guide you, then I will act on the precedents set by the prophet of God. But if the precedents fail, then I will exert to form my own judgment. The student of the history of Islam, however, is well aware that with the political expansion of Islam, systematic legal thought became an absolute necessity. And our early doctors of law, both of Arabian and non-Arabian descent, worked ceaselessly until all the accumulated wealth of legal thought found a final expression in our recognized schools of law. These schools of law recognize three categories of ijtihad. Number one, complete authority in legislation, which is practically confined to be founders of the school. Number two, relative authority, which is to be exercised within the limits of a particular school. And number three, special authority, which relates to the determining of the law applicable to a particular case left undetermined by the founders. In this paper, I am concerned with the first degree of ijtihad only, that is, complete authority in legislation. The theoretical possibility of this degree of ijtihad is admitted by the Sunnis, but in practice, it has always been denied ever since the establishment of the schools. Inasmuch as the idea of complete ijtihad is hedged around by conditions which are well nigh impossible of realization in a single individual. Such an attitude seems exceedingly strange in a system of law based mainly on the groundwork provided by the Quran, which embodies an essentially dynamic outlook on life. It is therefore necessary, before we proceed further, to discover the cause of this intellectual attitude which has reduced the law of Islam practically to a state of immobility. Some European writers think that the stationary character of the law of Islam is due to the influence of the Turks. This is an entirely superficial view, for the legal schools of Islam had been finally established long before the Turkish influence began to work in the history of Islam. The real causes are, in my opinions, as follows. Number one, we are all familiar with the rationalist movement which appeared in the Church of Islam during the early days of the Abbasids and the bitter controversies which it raised. Take, for instance, the one important point of controversy between the two camps, the conservative dogma of the eternity of the Quran. The rationalists denied it because they thought that this was only another form of the Christian dogma of the entirety of the word. On the other hand, the conservative thinkers, whom the later Abbasids, fearing the political implications of rationalism, gave their full support, thought that by denying the eternity of the Quran, the rationalists were undermining the very foundations of Muslim society. Nizam, for instance, practically rejected the traditions and openly declared Abu Huraira to be an untrustworthy reporter, thus partly owing to a misunderstanding of the ultimate motives of rationalism and partly owing to the unrestrained thought of particular rationalists. Conservative thinkers regarded this movement as a force of disintegration and considered it a danger to the stability of Islam as a social polity. Their main purpose, therefore, was to preserve the social integrity of Islam, and to realize this, the only course open to them was to utilize the binding force of Shariat and to make the structure of their legal system as rigorous as possible. Number 2, the rise and growth of ascetic Sufism, which gradually developed under the influences of a non-Islamic character. A purely speculative side is to a large extent responsible for this attitude. On its purely religious side, Sufism fostered a kind of revolt against the verbal quibbles of our early doctors. The case of Sufyan Thawri is an instance in point. He was one of the acutest legal minds of his time and was nearly the founder of a school of law. But being also intensely spiritual, the dry as dust subtleties of contemporary legists drove him to ascetic Sufism. On its speculative side, which developed later, Sufism is a form of free thought and in alliance with rationalism. The emphasis that it laid on the distinction of Zahir and Batin, appearance and reality, created an attitude of indifference to all that applies to appearance and not to reality. This spirit of total otherworldliness in latter Sufism obscured men's vision of a very important aspect of Islam as a social polity and offering the prospect of unrestrained thought on its speculative side. It attracted and finally absorbed the best minds in Islam. The Muslim state was thus left generally in the hands of intellectual mediocrities, and the unthinking masses of Islam, having no personalities of a higher caliber to guide them, found their security only in blindly following the schools. Number 3. On the top of all this came the destruction of Baghdad, the center of Muslim intellectual life, in the middle of the 13th century. This was indeed a great blow, and all the contemporary historians of the invasion of Tatars described the havoc of Baghdad with a half-suppressed pessimism about the future of Islam. For fear of further disintegration, which is only natural in such a period of political decay, the conservative thinkers of Islam focused all their efforts on the one point of preserving a uniform social life for the people by a jealous exclusion of all innovations in the law of Sharia, as expounded by the early doctors of Islam. Their leading idea was social order, and there is no doubt that they were partly right, because organization does, to a certain extent, counteract the forces of decay. But they did not see, and our modern ulema do not see, that the ultimate fate of a people does not depend so much on organization as on the worth and power of individual men. In an over-organized society, the individual is altogether crushed out of existence. He gains the whole wealth of social thought around him and loses his own soul. Thus, a false reverence for part past history and its artificial reconstruction constitute no remedy for a people's decay. The verdict of history, as a modern writer has happily put it, is that worn out ideas have never risen to power among a people who have worn them out. The only effective power, therefore, that counteracts the forces of decay in a people is the bearing of self concentrated individuals. Such individuals alone reveal the depth of life. They disclose new standards in the light of which we begin to see that our environment is not wholly inviolable and requires revision. The tendency to over organization by a false reverence of the past, as manifested in the legists of Islam in the 13th century and later, was contrary to the inner impulse of Islam and consequently invoked the powerful reaction of Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the most indefatigable writers and preachers of Islam, who was born in 1263, 5 years after the destruction of Baghdad. Ibn Taymiyyah was brought up in Hanbalite tradition. Claiming freedom of ijtihad for himself, he rose in revolt against the finality of the schools and went back to the first principles in order to make a fresh start. Ibn Hazm, the founder of the Zahiri school of law, he rejected the Hanafite principle of reasoning by analogy and ijma, as understood by older legists. For the thought agreement was the basis of our superstition. And there is no doubt that, considering the moral and intellectual decrepitude of his times, he was right in doing so. In the 16th century, Suyuti claimed the same privilege of ijtihad, to which he added the idea of a renovator at the beginning of each century. But the spirit of Ibn Taymiyyah's teaching found a fuller expression in a movement of immense potentialities which arose in the 18th century from the sands of Najd, described by MacDonald as the cleanest spot in the decadent world of Islam. It is really the first throb of life in modern Islam. To the inspiration of this movement, traceable directly or indirectly, nearly all the great modern movements of Muslim Asia and Africa. For example, the movement, the Pan-Islamic movement, and the Berber movement, which is only a Persian reflex of Arabian Protestantism. The great Puritan reformer, Mohammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was born in 1700, studied in Medina, traveled in Persia, and finally succeeded in spreading the fire of his restless soul throughout the whole world of Islam. He was similar in spirit to Ghazali's disciple, Muhammad ibn Arth, the Berber Puritan reformer of Islam who appeared amidst the decay of Muslim Spain and gave her a fresh inspiration. We are, however, not concerned with the political career of this movement, which was terminated by the armies of Muhammad Pasha. The essential thing to note is the spirit of freedom manifested in it, though inwardly this movement too is conservative in its own fashion. While it rises in revolt against the finality of the schools and vigorously asserts the right of private judgment, its vision of the past is wholly uncritical, and in matters of law, it mainly falls back on the traditions of the Prophet. Passing on to Turkey, we find that the idea of ijtihad, reinforced and broadened by modern philosophical ideas, has long been working in the religious and political thought of the Turkish nation. This is clear from Alim Ibn Sabit's new theory of Mohammedan law, grounded on modern sociological concepts. If the renaissance of Islam is a fact, and I believe it is a fact, we too one day, like the Turks, will have to re-evaluate our intellectual inheritance. And if we cannot make any original contribution to the general thought of Islam, we may, by healthy conservative criticism, serve at least as a check on the rapid movement of liberalism in the world of Islam. I now proceed to give you some idea of religio-political thought in Turkey, which will indicate to you how the power of Ijtihad is manifested in the recent thought and activity in that country. There were, a short time ago, two main lines of thought in Turkey represented by the Nationalist Party and the Party of Religious Reform. The point of supreme interest with the Nationalist Party is above all the state and not religion. With these thinkers, religion as such has no independent function. The state is the essential factor in national life which determines the character and function of all other factors. They, therefore, reject old ideas about the function of state and religion and accentuate the separation of church and state. Now, the structure of Islam as a religio-political system, no doubt, does permit such a view, though personally, I think it is a mistake to suppose that the idea of state is more dominant and rules all other ideas embodied in the system of Islam. In Islam, the spiritual and the temporal are not two distinct domains, and the nature of an act, however secular in its import, is determined by the attitude of the mind with which the agent does it. It is the invisible mental background of the act which ultimately determines its character. An act is temporal or profane if it is done in a spirit of detachment from the infinite complexity of life behind it. It is spiritual if it is inspired by that complexity. In Islam, it is the same reality which appears as church looked at from one point of view and state from another. It is not true to say that church and state are two sides or facets of the same thing. Islam is a single, unanalyzable reality, which is one or the other as your point of view varies. The point is extremely far-reaching, and a full elucidation of it will involve us in a highly philosophical discussion. Suffice it to say that this ancient mistake arose out of the bifurcation of the unity of man into two distinct and separate realities, which somehow have a point of contact, by which are, in essence, opposed to each other. The truth, however, is that the matter is spirit in space-time reference. The unity called man is body, when you look at it as acting in regard to what we call the external world. It is mind or soul when you look at it as acting in regard to the ultimate aim and ideal of such acting. The essence of Tawheed as a working idea is equality, solidarity, and freedom. The state, from the Islamic standpoint, is an endeavor to transform these ideal principles into space-time forces as aspiration to realize them in a definite human organization. It is in this sense alone that the state in Islam is a theocracy, not in the sense that it is headed by a representative of God on earth who can always screen his despotic will behind his supposed infallibility. The critics of Islam have lost sight of this important consideration. The ultimate reality, according to the Quran, is spiritual, and its life consists in its temporal activity. The spirit finds its opportunities in the natural, the material, the secular. All that is secular is, therefore, sacred in the roots of its being. The greatest service that modern thought has rendered to Islam, and as a matter of fact to all religion, consists in its criticism of what we call material or natural, a criticism which discloses that the merely material, has no substance until we discover it rooted in the spiritual. There is no such thing as a profane world. All this immensity of matter constitutes a scope for the self realization of spirit. All is holy ground. As the Prophet so beautifully puts it, the whole of this earth is a mosque. The state, according to Islam, is only an effort to realize the spiritual in human organization. But in this sense, all state, not based on mere dominance and aiming at the realization of ideal principles, is theocratic. The truth is that the Turkish nationalists assimilated the idea of the separation of church and state from the history of European political ideas. Primitive Christianity was founded not as a political or civil unit, but as a monastic order in a profane world, having nothing to do with civil affairs and obeying the Roman authority practically in all matters. The result of this was that when the state became Christian, state and church confronted each other as distinct powers with interminable boundary disputes between them. Such a thing could never happen in Islam, for Islam was from the very beginning a civil society, having received from the Quran a set of simple legal principles which, like the 12 tables of the Romans, carried as experience subsequently proved great potentialities of expansion and development by interpretation. The nationalist theory of state, therefore, is misleading inasmuch as it suggests a dualism which does not exist in Islam. The Religious Reform Party, on the other hand, led by Saad Halim Pasha, insisted on the fundamental fact that Islam is a harmony of idealism and positivism, and as a unity of the eternal verities of freedom, equality, and solidarity, has no fatherland. As there is no English mathematics, German astronomy, or French chemistry, says the Grand Vizier, so there is no Turkish, Arabian, Persian, or Indian Islam. Just as the universal character of scientific truths engenders varieties of scientific national cultures, which in their totality represent human knowledge. Much in the same way, the universal character of Islam varieties create varieties of national, moral, and social ideals. Modern culture, based as it is on national egoism, is, according to this keen-sighted writer, only another form of barbarism. It is the result of an overdeveloped industrialism through which men satisfy their primitive instincts and inclinations. He, however, deplores that during the course of history, the modern and social ideals of Islam have been gradually de-Islamized through the influence of local character and pre-Islamic superstitions of Muslim nations. These ideals today are more Iranian, Turkish, or Arabian than Islamic. The pure brow of the principle of Tawheed has received more or less an impress of Islam, and the universal and impersonal character of the ethical ideals of Islam has been lost through a process of localization. The only alternative open to us, then, is to tear off from Islam the hard crust which has immobilized an essentially dynamic outlook on life, and to rediscover the original verities of freedom, equality, and solidarity, with a view to rebuild our moral, social, and political ideals out of their original simplicity and universality. Such are the views of the Grand Vizier of Turkey. You will see that following a line of thought more in tune with the spirit of Islam, he reaches practically the same conclusion as the Nationalist Party, That is to say, the freedom of ijtihad with a view to rebuild the laws of Sharia in the light of modern thought and experience.